One engine, two pistons, no cylinder head. Why did Fairbanks-Morse build this bizarre design? And how did it put them on the map? The FM38D8 was more than another diesel engine. It was a mechanical oddball, an opposed piston design at a time when almost everyone else was sticking with the tried and true cylinder head. Here's how it worked. Instead of one piston and a head, each cylinder had two pistons, nose to nose, racing toward each other. At the top of the stroke, they nearly kissed, squeezing the fuel-air mixture between them until it exploded. One piston controlled intake, the other exhaust. No valves, no cylinder head, no rockers, no gaskets. All the usual suspects for engine failure? Gone. Fairbanks-Morse ripped them out of the equation. That was the genius and the madness. Because this design was more than efficient, it was considered heresy by the rest of the diesel world. It had undeniable advantages. Compact and light for its output, the 38D8 packed more horsepower into less space than conventional designs. With no head to crack or valves to burn, it could run harder, longer, and cooler than the competition. And in a world where space was money, on ships, in subs, in factories, that high power-to-weight ratio made it invaluable. But here's where it gets juicy. Rivals looked at the opposed piston like it was a monster stitched together in some backroom lab. EMD engineers dismissed it as too complicated. Alco scoffed and said it would never scale. Some even called it dangerous. To them, it wasn't revolutionary. It was reckless. A freak experiment better suited for textbooks than real-world service. Fairbanks-Morse didn't care. This was a company built on bold moves and bigger risks. By the 1930s, they already had a reputation for punching above their weight, supplying stationary engines for factories, power plants, and pumping stations. But they had their eyes on something far bigger, the marine market. And they weren't about to play it safe with the same tired designs their competitors were cranking out. So when they rolled out the 38D8, they didn't whisper. They shouted. Their marketing bragged about the diesel with no head to crack, no valves to burn, and no gaskets to blow. That went beyond clever copy. It was a slap across the face to EMD, Alco, and anyone else who doubted them. It was Fairbanks-Morse saying, "Your engines are dinosaurs. Ours is the future." And here's the thing. They weren't entirely bluffing. The opposed piston's compact, rugged design was tailor-made for submarines and surface ships. Submarine duty was the ultimate torture test. Cramped space, brutal heat, and the guarantee that if your engine failed, men would die. FM's radical design thrived in that environment. The very things that made rival engineers mock it, its weirdness, its strangeness, were exactly what made it perfect for undersea warfare. Still, the skepticism never fully went away. Behind closed doors, competitors laughed at Fairbanks-Morse, saying the design would never last, that it was too weird to go mainstream. Even some Navy brass doubted it, calling it a gamble at best. But history has a way of silencing doubters. Nobody knew it yet, but this so-called Frankenstein engine was about to prove itself not in factories or rivers, but deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, powering submarines that would bring Japan's supply lines to their knees. When the United States entered the Second World War, Fairbanks-Morse's opposed piston engines suddenly went from strange little experiment to the Navy's secret weapon. What had once been dismissed as a mechanical sideshow became the beating heart of America's silent service. The Navy needed engines that could survive the brutal realities of submarine warfare. Heat, pressure, shock, salt water, and neglect. Against all odds, the FM-38D8 proved to be that engine. You found them deep inside Gato-class and Balao-class submarines, pounding away mile after mile beneath the Pacific. You found them in landing craft storming the beaches of Tarawa and Normandy. You found them in auxiliary vessels and repair ships that kept the fleet alive. And here's the kicker. When the war started, even FM's harshest critics had to eat their words, because the opposed piston not only survived combat, it thrived in it. The record is almost embarrassing for the doubters. Crews swore by the engines, calling them the workhorses, because they just wouldn't quit. When a submarine slipped beneath the waves, sometimes for 70 days at a stretch, the only thing standing between the crew and death was whether the diesel would fire back to life when needed. And the FM opposed piston always did. Submariners put their faith in it like it was a member of the crew. But here's where the controversy comes in. The Navy didn't trust Fairbanks-Morse at first. In fact, before Pearl Harbor, senior officers openly mocked the opposed piston design. Some called it too complex for service at sea. Others claimed it was unreliable, unserviceable, and flat-out unsuitable for combat duty. Rival manufacturers, especially EMD and Winton, were only too happy to fan the flames. They lobbied the Navy brass, whispered in congressional ears, and pushed their own conventional designs. There were even stories that backroom politics nearly kept FM engines out of submarines altogether. But war has a way of cutting through politics. When American submarines needed more range, more reliability, and more efficiency than anyone else could offer, the FM 38D8 delivered. Its fuel economy was a game changer in the Pacific theater, where every extra mile of patrol endurance meant another convoy intercepted, another freighter sunk, another lifeline cut off from Japan. The very design that competitors sneered at gave American boats the stamina to strangle an island empire. And the irony? After the war, some of those same rivals tried to rewrite history, downplaying FM's role, painting EMD as the real hero of U.S. diesel power. But the record doesn't lie. Fairbanks-Morse engines carried submarines across the Pacific, powered invasions, and turned what was once considered an oddity into one of the most decisive pieces of machinery in modern naval history. By 1945, Fairbanks-Morse had become more than an engine builder. They were a cornerstone of American victory. The 38D8 won respect. It humiliated its critics. It proved that bold innovation, not safe bets, was what carried America through the deadliest war in history. After the war, Fairbanks-Morse treated their opposed piston engine like a golden ticket. If the 38D8 could survive depth charges, saltwater, and 70-day patrols in the Pacific, surely it could handle something as simple as hauling freight across America. In their eyes, the engineering that won wars would now win markets. Their first big step was the Erie-built locomotives, assembled by General Electric in Erie, Pennsylvania. These locomotives were more than machines. They were statements. With sleek car bodies and radical styling, they looked nothing like the boxy EMD diesels that dominated the rails. Inside, they packed FM's unique opposed piston heart. For a moment, it looked like the future had arrived. Railroads took notice. Then came the Trainmaster. A brute force monster at 3,500 horsepower. At its debut, it was the most powerful diesel locomotive in the world. On paper, FM were blowing them out of the water. But here's the ugly truth. The rails aren't the ocean. And what worked under the crushing pressure of the Pacific turned into a maintenance nightmare on land. The first blow came in the shops. Navy mechanics were trained for months to service opposed piston engines, living in cramped engine rooms, tearing them down under wartime pressure. Railroad shops. They had crews who could pull the head off an EMD 567, swap out parts, and have the unit back online in a single shift. The FM opposed piston was a whole different animal. 2 crankshafts, complicated gearing, exotic tooling, and a layout that made even routine repairs a marathon. To shop crews, it wasn't innovation. It was a headache. Some mechanics flat out told their bosses, "Don't buy these things again." Cooling was another silent killer. On a submarine, with unlimited access to seawater heat exchangers, the engine could shed heat all day. In a locomotive car body, not so much. The engines ran hot, too hot. Overheating became a chronic problem, especially when pulling long freights or climbing grades. Railroads don't forgive downtime. Every hour in the shop was money lost. And then came the politics. EMD were selling a complete ecosystem. Parts warehouses, manuals, field reps, training programs, a nationwide support machine. Fairbanks-Morse? They had none of that. To railroads, FM felt like the odd man out, asking them to gamble on a radical design without the safety net of EMD's vast service network. Even worse, many mechanics simply hated the engines. They weren't shy about saying so, and their voices carried weight in boardrooms. The result was brutal. Railroads that were dazzled at first quickly soured. The trainmaster's horsepower looked great on a spec sheet, but in the real world, FM's opposed piston design was earning a reputation not as a hero, but as a costly liability. Fairbanks-Morse had tried to storm the rails with raw innovation and brute strength. But railroading isn't a battlefield, it's a grind. And in that grind, practicality, simplicity, and serviceability beat brilliance every single time. While Fairbanks-Morse was clinging to its dream of revolutionizing American railroads, EMD was quietly stacking the deck. Not with brilliance, not with daring innovation, but with something far more deadly in the long run: reliability and service. The EMD 567 and later the 645 weren't exotic. They weren't radical. They didn't inspire awe or admiration, but they were bulletproof, simple, durable, forgiving. The kind of machine that didn't care if your shop crew was tired, undertrained, or cutting corners. It would still run. And when it didn't, EMD made sure it was back in service before the ink dried on the work order. EMD built an empire. Warehouses stocked to the rafters, service manuals written like Bibles, field techs parachuted in to fix anything at a moment's notice. They sold railroads something far more valuable than horsepower: peace of mind. And in the cutthroat world of railroading, peace of mind was everything. A single breakdown on the main line was more than a hiccup. It was blood in the water. Delayed freights, missed connections, angry customers threatening to pull business, crews burning overtime as trains sat lifeless on the rails. Every minute lost meant dollars evaporating. Railroads didn't want a masterpiece. They wanted a workhorse. Fairbanks-Morse thought they could give them both. They brought the opposed piston, a marvel at sea, a legend in submarines, an engine that had literally helped win a world war. On paper, it was genius. In practice on the rails, it was a disaster. Overheating, endless teardowns, overhauls that drained budgets, maintenance nightmares that sent crews cursing and bleeding knuckles in the shop bays. What was supposed to be a revolutionary machine turned into a shop queen, a prima donna in a business that had no patience for drama. The whispers started in the back shops first. Crews hated them. Some flat out refused to touch the opposed piston, calling it a mechanical abomination. And when mechanics despise a machine, when they're telling management, "Don't buy these again," that poison spreads fast. Here's the part no one wanted to admit out loud. Railroads grew to hate them. Executives weren't asking, "Should we give FM another chance?" They were asking, "Why the hell are we bleeding money on these when EMD is practically begging to make our lives easier?" By the mid-1950s, the verdict was in, and the guillotine came down. EMD owned the rails. Alco was gasping for breath, and Fairbanks-Morse, once the proud supplier of America's most trusted submarine engines, was reduced to a cautionary tale. Their grand gamble, their moonshot, their opposed piston dream was collapsing into a smoking crater. And that's the tragedy. The opposed piston wasn't a bad engine. It was ahead of its time. It was brilliant. But brilliance doesn't matter when the battlefield doesn't want it. At sea, it was a war hero. On land, it was a liability. Fairbanks-Morse were betrayed by it. Railroading wasn't about innovation. It wasn't about daring ideas. It was about uptime, predictability, and trust. EMD sold comfort. FM sold headaches. And in the brutal logic of business, the better engine didn't win. The safer bet did. Fairbanks-Morse bet their future on brilliance, and America's railroads told them, in no uncertain terms, "We don't want brilliance. We want easy." And that's how a war hero was left to die in the roundhouse, abandoned by the very industry it tried to save. The 38D8 may have stumbled on the rails, but it never vanished. In marine service and stationary power plants, it remained a trusted workhorse for decades. Ships, tugs, and power stations ran those opposed pistons long after the railroads gave up on them, because the design's efficiency and ruggedness were undeniable. Ask any engineer who kept one alive. They'll tell you, When tuned right, these engines could run like nothing else. And here's the twist. What many dismissed as a relic is now making a comeback. Opposed piston technology is back in the headlines. Companies like Achades Power are reviving the layout with 21st century engineering, promising lower emissions, higher fuel economy, and compact power plants that once again challenge conventional piston design. The U.S. military is investing in them. Some commercial manufacturers are watching closely. It feels almost poetic. The same principles that put Fairbanks-Morse on the map in the 1930s, compactness, efficiency, and raw durability, are once again relevant in a world desperate for cleaner, tougher engines. But maybe that's the real legacy of the 38D8. Not that it was perfect, not that it conquered every market, but that it dared to be different. It wasn't afraid to throw away the rule book, to say, what if we build an engine with no head, no valves, and no weak points? In submarines, that gamble paid off. In locomotives, it nearly broke the company. But in history, it carved out a place few engines ever achieve. Fairbanks-Morse may not have won the railroad wars, but the opposed piston engine cemented their name in engineering legend. It was the machine that put the company on the map, carried submarines through the darkest days of war, and left behind a legacy still shaping the engines of tomorrow. Because sometimes the boldest ideas, the ones everyone else calls crazy, are the ones that endure. The FM38D8 was more than an engine. It was a radical idea, an unconventional design that changed naval warfare, reshaped diesel engineering, and left a mark that is still felt today. Sometimes going against convention really does change history. If stories like the Fairbanks-Morse opposed piston still speak to you, there's a whole world of forgotten engines and mechanical legends waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to the channel, share this journey with other gearheads, and let me know your thoughts below. Did FM's radical design deserve more credit, or was it destined to be a legend that burned bright and faded fast?